May 19th, 1863, William Tecumseh Sherman's men led the way. They were stopped cold by the Confederates, who had strengthened their barricades considerably in recent weeks. This is a death struggle and will be terrible. Sherman wrote his wife afterward. May 19th, 1863. May 19th, 1863. When they asked about the conquered Confederates, one of his generals said, "Hey, Abe Lincoln, what are we supposed to do with these Confederates? We conquered them." And he says, "Well, if they surrender and they give up their arms and they peacefully go to jail, let them up easy. Let them up easy." He even suggested letting them keep their guns. At the end, when they could go back home, there's somebody else did. I forget. Lee. I think U.S. Grant and Lee, they let Lee's soldiers keep their guns. John Wilkes Booth was written in India ink in the back of one of his hands since he was a boy. So they knew that it was John Wilkes Booth's body. When John Wilkes Booth went to the Garrett's farm, they said that he had given a false name. And then some people said there was an actual guy with that name. And so they said, well, that was the real person. But 19 of the 20 people who identified his body said that it was, or 9 out of 10. There's only one person that said that it wasn't his body, which that would be interesting to read that account. But you have a lot of people that knew John Wilkes Booth. He was a popular fucking actor in the fucking day. So people, he had a telltale scar, and then a plugged tooth, a broken left leg with an old shoe. Lafayette Baker gave an intact diary to Edwin Stanton, and the 18 pages were ripped out. So we know it was John Wilkes Booth. We know it was his body. He had the scar, the plugged tooth, the broken left leg. He also had JWB written on his India ink. His family, everybody said it was him. The only thing that's important to know, because in the theater, you got 20 to 30 fucking witnesses. So you have a lot of people saying the same shit. But when the the feds are chasing after John Wilkes Booth, only David Harold, he would have a good fucking testimony about what the hell was going on. And John Wilkes Booth, those are the only last two people. Also think about this too. When you consider, is it part of a greater conspiracy? Patsy, right? You had fucking Lee Harvey Oswald said that he was a patsy. They said he killed, JFK, and then he got shot and killed like 2 days afterwards. Why? Because he had a lot of information. He may have hated the president, but other people around him hated the president too. And then once they got him to do their dirty work, then they got rid of him. And so the guy who shot him makes me Boston Corbett. Did Boston Corbett do his, good patriotic duty, or was he part of the Vatican? Now, why the Vatican? Well, there's only one little connection with the Vatican. John Surratt. Mary Surratt's going to get hung. John Surratt was the son. They both are Confederate pieces of shit. John Surratt runs away, though, and he goes to Montreal, Canada, and he finds refuge in a Catholic church. Some Catholic priest offers him sanctuary, and he's able to live for several years, comes back, does a civil trial, and then he's saved from the gallows or something. I forget. He really doesn't get much punishment. John Surratt takes off to Canada and then comes back 4 or 5 years later. Edmund Spangler, 6 years in prison. So Edmund Spangler just held John Wilkes Booth's horse for a minute. You held his horse? Well, that's 6 years in prison. Now, he probably was a Confederate piece of shit, but that's interesting. Just holding the guy's horse. Basically it depends on who you are. Somebody once told me in Costilla County, one of the jailers in Costilla County says it's not what you do, it's who you do it to. So Edmund Spangler, he just had the horse, right? He held the horse, and he's a nobody. He gets 6 years in prison. John Surratt, well, he's a well-to-do person who ran the fuck off, and now he's in Montreal 5 years later. Everybody's getting pardons anyways. Senator John Conness of California, Senator John Conness. It's almost like the damn Hales. Senator Hales, Senator John Conness, he says, "I'm ruined if this ever gets out." And apparently when he was reading John Wilkes Booth's diary, He was reading John Wilkes Booth's diary. Oh my God, I'm ruined if this ever gets out. 18 pages were ripped out by Edwin Stanton's people. Lafayette Baker gave an intact diary to Edwin Stanton. You know, before you give any of the evidence to the cops or to the fucking feds or something, why don't you take a picture of the picture? Make a copy of the fucking thing before you pass it on to anybody else. They'll take the original fucking thing, the diary of John Wilkes Booth. You know how important that diary is just for history, for truth, for just to find out what the fuck is going on? It's insane that John Wilkes Booth thought he could just go straight up to Abraham Lincoln with only one gun and one bullet and one dagger. John Frederick Parker wasn't there, nor U.S. Grant or Edward Stanton's people. No cops, no Metropolitan, D.C., nobody. "50 random-ass bodyguards essentially all let him down. But knowing that if John Frederick Parker was there, it wouldn't have happened. So that's so fucking important. If John Frederick Parker or anybody else, one other cop, one other police officer, one other friend of Abraham Lincoln, just a stalwart of stalwart, just a big, loyal Abraham Lincoln man could just stay outside. That saves Lincoln's life. Henry Rathburn tried to fight, but he's the only one that fought back. John Parker drank at the same damn saloon, the Star Saloon, as John Wilkes Booth. And then we believe in the thin blue line, or does he have friends higher ups? He kept his job for 3 fucking years. Mary Todd Lincoln had to say, "Get out. No, you were the one that dereliction of duty, motherfucker." Even if you give him the most generous interpretation ever, John Frederick Parker went to the bar, got drunk, and either fell asleep in the theater or somewhere else. And it doesn't make sense because, to me, with John Wilkes Booth wanting to kill Lincoln, why did you only have one gun with one bullet? You're going to use your dagger to kill U.S. Grant? You're going to use your dagger to kill John Parker? You're going to use your dagger to kill the person guarding Lincoln? No, I bet you John Wilkes Booth probably knew he could get close to Lincoln. He could get that close to Lincoln. Maybe walk past the door a couple times and see when the door wasn't being guarded. But I just feel like John Wilkes Booth, why don't you carry like one bullet or maybe 2 bullets, maybe 3 bullets? What if you misfire? Lewis Powell tried to shoot one of the Seward sons and his gun misfired. It happens. It happens. It happened that night with one of the other co-conspirators. 8 co-conspirators are going to get caught and found guilty by a military tribunal. 4 of them are going to get hung. George Atzerodt and David Harold and Lewis Powell and Mary Surratt all were hung. Apparently they were part of the Knights of the Golden Circle. So the Knights of the Golden Circle, that's an interesting little name, isn't it? Why Jesuits or the Freemasons or the Vatican? That's always what people say. Knights of the Golden Circle. That sounds like that's a lead that I would follow up. If I'm like, what's the bigger conspiracy? Is there a bigger conspiracy? Probably not, right? Jefferson Davis paid John Wilkes Booth to be a fucking spy. John Wilkes Booth killed the fucking president, right? So it's kind of in the story. He's a racist, white supremacist piece of shit. Maybe there was, bigger forces surrounding him. So Lewis Powell and David Harold went to go kill William Seward. They messed up. George Atzerodt was supposed to kill Andrew Johnson. And Booth, they met April 14th to work this out. But ultimately, their damn thing, if they're trying to... The secession of America is president, vice president, speaker of the House. It doesn't make any sense that David Harold and Lewis Powell went to go kill William Seward because he's the speaker, he's the secretary of the state. So that's Secretary of the War would make more sense. Edwin Stanton would make more sense. Why William Seward? I guess William Seward was like Abraham Lincoln's best fucking friend or some shit. So I guess in motherfucking John Wilkes Booth's mind, the 3 most powerful men was William Seward, Andrew Johnson, and Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln had a grandfather who got killed. I don't know if it's by the Shawnee, but it's by the Native Americans. A drunk, you'll never be the actor your father was, somebody told John Wilkes Booth that, and he's like, oh yeah? Well, after tonight, I'm going to be the most famous actor in the world. James Pumphrey was a horse renter. James Pumphrey. And then somebody else is going to hold the damn thing for him, James Pumphrey. And then somebody else. So you had the horse renter. Booth wrote a letter to the National Intelligencer newspaper saying how he and Powell and Harold and Atzerodt were to kill Abraham Lincoln. So John Wilkes Booth wrote in a diary and he wrote a letter to the National Intelligencer. That would be interesting. What's that letter to the National Intelligencer say? Like, if you're like, well, I wonder why he did that. So Knights of the Golden Circle we need to check out. And then that letter to the National Intelligencer. So we're comparing and contrasting, lone gunmen, even small lone gunmen, have a small conspiracy. Edmund Spangler, he held John Wilkes Booth. He held his horse for a bit. Actually, no, it was Joe Burrows. So Edmund Spangler, I think, is going to go to prison for 6 years. Edmund Spangler goes to prison for 6 years for allegedly holding John Wilkes Booth's horse, but he didn't even hold the horse. He did get Joe Burrows to hold the horse for him, though. So he was basically responsible for the thing. Henry Rathbone, he fought back. He was the only one. The only thing John Wilkes Booth took with him was a single-shot 41 caliber Derringer pistol. He just had a single-shot 41 caliber Derringer pistol with one bullet and one dagger. After he shot and killed Lincoln, Lincoln slumps over in his chair. He's dead immediately, basically. He drops his gun, and then he stabs Henry Rathbone, who gets up to try to defend him or attack him. Henry grabs at John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth jumps over the balcony. He trips over the curtain, hurts his leg, bloody knife in the air, Sic Semper Tyrannis. Henry Rathbone shouts, "Stop that man!" Booth stabbed the orchestra leader when he tried to stop him. So both of them, actually, Lewis Powell's trying to get out of the house, he has to stab a person. So, I mean, John Wilkes Booth is a pretty decent soldier in some respects. And then he goes to the side door across the stage, and then that's where the horse, Joe Burrows, was holding the horse. Dr. Charles Leake, something. He removes a blood clot from the gunshot wound, and that apparently helped Abraham Lincoln breathe better. But he removed the blood clot. The blood was clotting to stop the bleeding. He's got a bullet in his fucking head. But I guess you got to get the bullet out because that's like poisoning, right? Some kind of metal mercury poisoning. Naval Yard Bridge. So John Wilkes Booth he's in Union territory. He's got to cross checkpoint after checkpoint. He gets to the Navy Yard Bridge. And he was able to get to the Anacostia River to Maryland. He got through. He got through because he just did that old golly gee shucks, it's 9 o'clock, I'm late, my wife is going to be so mad at me. Abraham Lincoln was taken to the Petersons' home. Apparently he had such a long body that they had to lay his body diagonally. David Harold and John Wilkes Booth meet up on the way to Mary Surratt's Tavern. So they meet back up 9 miles south of D.C. So Mary Surratt's Tavern is only 9 miles south of D.C. That's where they get their supplies, and then they go onwards to Dr. Samuel Mudd's house, and that's where John Wilkes Booth gets his leg set. David Harold left Lewis Powell to fend for himself. Lewis Powell goes into the house of William Seward, and he's like stabbing everybody, and everybody's screaming. There's blood everywhere. Lewis Powell was left to fend for himself. David Harold heard the screaming and just took off. He left the horse, apparently, by the tree and then took off. David Harold is eventually going to meet up with John Wilkes Booth, and David Harold is going to be the Confederate man that was right next to John Wilkes Booth right before he gets shot in that tobacco barn. So David Harold is very much a fucking coward in some respects. That might be our guy. That might be the Union guy. That might be a Lincoln man, a good American man right there. David Harold pretending to be on the Confederate side, but really being an incompetent piece of shit. Joe Burrows held John Wilkes Booth as his horse. And then apparently another guy was asked to do so, James Pumphrey. So he rented the horse from James Pumphrey. He didn't get in trouble. Joe Burrows. Edmund Spangler, held the horse. He held the horse outside the alley, though. So that was like... And then Edmund Spangler had something else to do, so he said, "Oh, I'll just get Joe Burrows to do it." So Joe Burrows didn't get in trouble when it was actually Joe Burrows. But if Joe Burrows is the employee of Edmund Spangler, then it's Edmund Spangler now, isn't it? George Atzerodt was arrested in Germantown, Maryland, at his cousin's house. George Atzerodt. He went to the Kirkwood Hotel to kill Andrew Johnson, but got cold feet and did not do so, and walked away. John Surratt fled to Canada, Montreal, Canada. And so did Simon Gerty. So I guess a bunch of great people, a bunch of greats and fakes, a bunch of fakes and greats that flee to Canada. Simon Gerty fled to Canada, and I love Simon Gerty. John Surratt goes to Montreal. Maybe it's Montreal that's the... And there's the Catholic fucking... What are you doing hiding Confederates for, you fucking... No William Creek, no Ward Lamone, Clara Harris, Knights of the Golden Circle, John Frederick Parker. Where was John Frederick Parker at, you piece of shit? Where was Edmund Stanton? Where was U.S. Grant? Hey, Mary Todd, why can't you get along with Julia Grant, you piece of shit, if U.S. Grant was there? Well, it still might have happened. Henry Rathbone was there. Maybe not. U.S. Grant is... He knows how to fight, right? Isn't he a fighter? That's why I think Marianne Williamson needs The Rock right next to her. Marianne Williamson needs The Rock right next to her. April 15th, 2 a.m. The War Department, Edwin Stanton, they go to the Surratt's house, and that's when they catch all of them. Mary's neighbor said that they saw Booth over there. John Wilkes Booth was okay with slavery. Mary Surratt, Mary's servants, so she had slaves. 2 a.m., April 15th in the morning, though. That's right after Abraham Lincoln is shot and killed, basically, 10, 12 or something he gets killed. 10, 12 p.m., and then they call it 7:22 a.m., but he's basically dead right then and there. But in between that time frame, Abraham Lincoln was still breathing, and at 2 a.m., they're over at Mary Surratt's house. So Lincoln was at the Ford's Theater. He wasn't... They said it was advertised, and then it said it wasn't advertised. John Parker was Abe's bodyguard, supposed to be. Goes drinking. Mary Todd didn't fight Booth at all. Mary Todd's hanging out with Confederates left and right. Who the fuck is she talking to? What's she talking about? She was tickling Abraham Lincoln, so kept him distracted. Dr. Samuel Mudd, Clarence Mudd, Dr. Mudd. Is it Samuel? He escaped being hung by one vote. And then he's going to get pardoned in 1869 by Andrew Johnson. Can you believe that? One vote. So they convicted Dr. Mudd. He's the motherfucker that set John Wilkes Booth's leg after 6 or 7 days into it, so John Booth could live for another 4 or 5 days. And he also sent the feds in the wrong direction. He lied to him. And he knew him beforehand. He was very much... Dr. Mudd was big time. He also, when he got out, he's going to get pardoned. He's going to have 9 kids. He's like, holy shit. That was, he was a baby boomer, right? He was a... John Wilkes Booth, let's see, killed intentionally to keep... You think he was killed intentionally to keep his mouth shut like Lee Harvey Oswald? Andrew Johnson became president. So, just shut your mouth. Nah, there's no conspiracy. We don't want to... John Wilkes Booth is going to get killed in Richard Garrett's barn. He had a diary. 18 pages were ripped out of John Wilkes Booth's diary. Apparently Lafayette Baker had the intact diary, and then he handed it to Edwin Stanton, and then after it went to Stanton's office and people, 18 pages were ripped out. That makes you think of the 8 minutes, how many minute gap? 6 minutes. There was like a so many minute gap on the Nixon tapes. And then they blamed it on the clerk. The clerk didn't copy it correctly. Interesting. Senator Conness. Apparently Senator Conness of California was connected to George Atzerodt. Senator Conness, why are you connected to George Atzerodt? He says, Senator Conness says that if the information of his connection to George Atzerodt ever got out, he was ruined. Oh yeah, Buster. Oh yeah, Mr. McGee. You'll never be the actor your father was. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. The Chinese were in America in 1421 with the treasure fleets. You had the Bimini Beach, Zhu Wen, Judah Benjamin. What is this? The Gene Rotz World Map. 1421. When did China discover America? 1421. When did the Vikings discover America? 1000 AD. When did the Native Americans get here? 14,000 years ago. And then Columbus, fucking 1492. So it's going to take 9 days. It's going to take 9 days before the feds get to Booth, and then it's going to take 11 days before America, the Union, and Lincoln's people to kill Booth. So John Wilkes Booth got to live at least for another week afterwards. How is that possible? A lone nut, a lone gunman with one bullet, one gun killed the president, and he was able to live 11 days afterwards? Holy shit. Lewis Powell ditched his horse and hid in the cemetery for 3 days. That was after David Harold had totally ditched him. David Harold, what a coward. David Harold said, all right, Lewis Powell, do your thing. Lewis Powell goes in there and just starts stabbing everybody, and David Harold takes off, runs into John Wilkes Booth, and then was like, yeah, sorry about that whole deserting David, and then he's going to desert John Wilkes Booth. He deserted fucking David Harold, deserted Lewis Powell, and then David Harold deserted John Wilkes Booth. And I don't want to say he's like, clean. David Harold is going to get hung. David Harold is going to get hung. So him, abandoning his friend in his time of need, that didn't bode well for his sentencing afterwards, Joe Johnston's men, 86,000 strong. They could have kept fighting. They could have just been an independent army out in the field forever and ever and ever. But, Jefferson Davis had to be one fucking badass mother. Richmond fell. Lee surrendered. Jefferson Davis still stands, but he's pissed. He's pissed off. I think that rule? The obvious explanation, the clearest obvious explanation is most likely right. Occam's razor. So, John Wilkes Booth, part of the fucking Confederacy, somehow knew some people, tried to Mary Surratt. It could have been all just surrounding Mary Surratt. Lewis Powell was doing everything for Mary Surratt. And I guess she's, just physically, she's an attractive person, but she has no morals. And in fact, her lack of morals is wickedness. The vacuum that you think of Mary Surratt with no virtues, that's wickedness. So Lincoln went to see our American cousin. I wonder, was it worth it? Was it a good fucking Mary Surratt? Sinister as fuck. Yes, she's right there in the middle of the damn thing. Doesn't make sense that they went after the president, vice president, and then the secretary of state. If Lewis Powell would have gone, it would have made more sense to destabilize the United States of America by going after the vice president, president, and then the House Speaker. So his fucking plan doesn't even make sense. His conspiracy to get the vice president and to get the secretary of state doesn't make sense. The revolver, Spencer carbines, our American cousin. The ego on actors, huh? George Atzerodt, Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell. You sometimes went by Lewis Payne. Lewis Powell, they caught him at Surratt's house. He's all nicely dressed. He had an allegiance oath. It said, L. Payne, I declare allegiance to America. He misspelled his own name, I guess, to throw everybody off. So Richmond fell, Lee surrendered, and John Wilkes Booth, this racist piece of shit, white supremacist, pro-slavery, is just so fucking pissed off that everything that he felt like he was fighting for the last 3 or 4 years, him and Mary Surratt and all of his buddies were laughing about it and making all this shit. John Wilkes Booth was actually at Lincoln's inauguration, which is crazy. Ronald Reagan says that the president must be an actor. So interesting, Ronald Reagan. Stanton said he said no to the theater project. So even if there's not a major conspiracy, with these lone nuts, you had a lot of people got, Martin Luther King was killed by a lone nut. Malcolm X was killed by 2 or 3 people. So there's a conspiracy right there. If you got more than one person, it's already a conspiracy. There's 2 people, well, they had to have conspired together to have got to the person, right? Now, the reason why I mentioned the president, vice president, and Speaker of the House, Colfax. He talked to Colfax. The Speaker of the House at the time was a man named Colfax. And that's interesting that they were going to kill the president and the vice president and the Secretary of State, but not the Speaker of the House, which would have made Colfax the president. Colfax talked to Lincoln right the day of his fucking assassination. But he always talks to his cabinet and his fucking senators and fucking whatnot. It could be the Illuminati, the Freemasons, the Jesuits, the Vatican, but ultimately, I think it's important to talk about the Lincoln assassination as precisely as we can. If there's no smoking gun of some major fucking conspirators, let's just keep the small. Is it possible that small, dedicated teams of people can change the world? That's what Margaret Mead said. Margaret Mead said, indeed, that's the only thing that's ever changed the world. Small, organized tribes of people, that's the only way the world has ever been changed. So it doesn't make any sense that Lewis Powell and David Harold went to go murder William Seward when he was only the Secretary of the State and not the Speaker of the House, Colfax. If anything, I'd like to look into Colfax more. Who is this Colfax? But that Conness, that seems like that's a weird fucking thing. He's like, we're ruined, right? Oh my God, if this gets out, we're ruined. That's a fucked up thing. And then is it possible to ever find out those fucking diary pages? Do you think they just fucking burn the diary? Do you think those diary papers could ever fucking come back? That'd be Samuel Mudd. Dr. Samuel Mudd was that fucker's name. So what am I writing down? I'm writing down something I want to check out later on. I'm forgetting what it is. So let's just put this on over here and keep plowing away. So Mary Surratt gives like this football locker room halftime speech, right? She's fucking, this is her troops. It's Mary Surratt's fucking conspiracy. Who's Mary Surratt? Where was she getting her money from? Who was in her hotel? Who was at her bar? The getaway was pretty impressive, I must say. 9 to 11 days later, the Underground Railroad, the reverse Underground Railroad. Lincoln got shot in the back of the head. So, Knights of the Golden Circle, letter to the National Intelligencer was his letter. And then the other thing was Conness, Senator Conness. And then Senator Hale. And then there's other books that have kind of like deep dived into these things. And it'd be worth a look. Because essentially, I don't know if there is an official story. The story seems to be pieces all over the place, what historians and whatever people with common sense can sort of figure out and make sense of. So this is my understanding. I compiled all the information, I've read a couple books and compiled some information and then just made sense of it for myself. Lucy Hale, Senator Conness, Knights of the Golden Circle. They called themselves Knights of the Golden Circle, and then they also had a letter to the National Intelligencer. John Wilkes Booth had wrote that letter, so that'd be interesting to see what that letter says. Now, even though Lewis Powell had said, no, Mary Surratt was innocent, she had nothing to do with any of it. George Atzerodt had nothing to do with any of it. If anything, he sat at the Kirkwood Hotel, and then he was kind of put there. And then got cold feet. So out of all of them, George Atzerodt was going to do some shit. He thought about doing some shit. Went to the hotel to do some shit, but got cold feet and walked away. And then threw his murder weapon into the gutter. So out of all the 4 people that got hung, I would say George Atzerodt was the most innocent of the 4 people that got hung. Mary Surratt was not innocent. That Harold was not innocent. And Lewis Powell was not innocent. And in some respects, we're all guilty of not doing all the good that could have been done. So just because Edwin Stanton and U.S. Grant wasn't there that night, that doesn't necessarily, just because Mary Todd didn't fight back, he did just kind of come up on Lincoln out of nowhere. Lewis Powell's a fucking maniac. For 30 minutes he fought until eventually he got hung and killed. Put a barrel to Frederick's head or chest. Pistol whipped him. He attacked like 3 or 4 people afterwards. It was like all this damage by one person. The canvas and metal splint for William Seward, it saved his life. David Harold tied Lewis's pal's horse to a tree and then fled. And that's all the notes that I got. That's all the notes that I got. So what can we say? Well, I guess Tucker Carlson is an asshole.